Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most critical skills for late season hunters, judging the freshness of sign when the weather turns cold. When bugles go silent, elk are slipping into survival mode and the mountains feel empty. The only thing that keeps you in the game is your ability to read what the land is telling you. Every track, every dropping, every bed in the frost is a clue. But in colder weather, those clues behave differently than they do in September sunshine. Snow, frost, and freezing temps can preserve sign for days or erase it in hours. And if you don't know how to tell the difference, you'll waste time chasing ghosts. In this episode, we're breaking down the real-world tactics I've used for over 3 decades of Western hunts, how to read tracks in snow and frozen ground, how droppings change in cold temps, what melted beds and crystallized frost can tell you, and how to layer all of those details into a reliable system. By the end, you'll know how to judge with confidence whether you're hours behind, a day behind, or tracking animals that are still close. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of hunters make in colder weather is assuming that all sign looks fresher than it really is. Snow and frost are natural preservatives. A set of elk tracks that would be melted, dried, and aged beyond recognition in September sun can look nearly perfect 3 days later when it's cold. That's both a blessing and a curse. It means you can often read sign long after it was made, but it also means you can burn a lot of boot leather chasing animals that are nowhere near that area anymore. The key here is remembering that fresh sign isn't just about what you see, it's about how the environment has interacted with it. Cold weather slows down decomposition, drying, and scent dispersion. Droppings that would turn chalky in a single warm afternoon can stay moist for days if they freeze overnight. Beds pressed into frost may hold their melted outlines well into the afternoon. Even broken twigs and scraped bark can hold color and moisture much longer than in warmer months. If you judge freshness the same way you would in September, you'll be wrong more often than not. This is why developing a cold weather eye is so important. You're not just looking at sign in isolation, you're measuring it against temperature swings, wind exposure, sunlight, and snow conditions. I've had days where elk moved through a basin before daylight, and by mid-morning their tracks still look like they'd just been made, crisp and sharp in the frozen ground. I've also had days where I cut a trail at noon, thought it was brand new, and realized later I was looking at 3-day-old tracks preserved perfectly in the shade of north-facing timber. Another factor is that animals themselves behave differently in colder weather. Elk and mule deer conserve energy and move less. That means less sign being created overall, and the sign you do find has more weight to it. If you cut into a fresh trail in November, chances are high you're looking at one of the only movements those animals made in the last 24 hours. The fresher your read, the more likely you are to connect. So why does this matter? Because your ability to separate fresh enough to hunt from too old to waste time is what keeps you effective in the late season. Hunters who don't learn this skill often spend their days covering country that looks busy but is actually cold and empty. Hunters who do learn it get to work in tighter windows, put themselves in front of animals that are still in the area, and capitalize on opportunities when others are hiking blind. The rest of this episode is going to break down how to do just that by looking at each type of sign individually, learning how cold conditions change its appearance, and then bringing it all together into a system that you can trust in the field. When most hunters think about reading sign in cold weather, tracks in the snow are the first thing that comes to mind, and for good reason, right? Snow is the cleanest canvas you'll ever get for following animals, but it can also be one of the most deceptive if you don't know how to read the fine details. The first thing I always look at is the edge of the track. Fresh tracks in snow have crisp, sharp outlines. You can often see every detail of the hoof, the dew claws, the separation between the toes, even small ridges left behind as the hoof pressed down. But those sharp edges don't last long. Sun, wind, and even a small rise in temperature will soften and round them. If you see edges that are melted and sagging, chances are that track isn't from this morning. It might be a day or two old. The depth of the track is the next giveaway. A fresh animal that just passed will leave a print that looks like it still carries weight. The snow is compacted, maybe even squeaky under your boot if you press into it. If the bottom of the track has already crusted over with ice or snow has fluffed back in, that tells you it's been sitting a while. Wind is the biggest culprit here. Even a light breeze can drift powder into the track, making something that's only a few hours old look days older. Conversely, calm, shaded conditions can preserve tracks for longer than you'd think. One trick I use consistently is to compare the track to my own boot print, right? If I step next to it, how does my edge look in the same snow? Does my boot sink deeper or shallower? Does my edge stay crisp while the animals look softened? That comparison can immediately tell you whether the track has aged through melting or wind, or if it's legitimately fresh. Now, frozen ground is its own challenge, right? When snow is thin or patchy, you'll often be reading tracks stamped into hard dirt, frost, or icy mud. In those conditions, the presence of moisture becomes your friend. A fresh track on frozen ground often has tiny crystals along the edges where the hoof broke through the frost. You might see darker soil pushed up that hasn't had time to dry. If the track is older, those edges glaze over, the soil lightens in color, and the frost crystals disappear. Another detail I pay attention to is animal behavior within the tracks. In cold weather, animals tend to move with purpose. If I see a line of elk tracks cutting straight across a ridge, I know they were moving with intent, probably feeding to bedding, right? That gives me a time frame to work with. If tracks are scattered, wandering with lots of starts and stops, that tells me they were feeding right there, and that's a place worth slowing down. The freshness combined with the behavior tells me whether I should stay on the trail or circle ahead. Finally, remember the impact of slope and exposure. A south-facing slope with morning sun will melt and soften tracks quickly. That same track in a shaded north face pocket may look brand new hours later. The danger is assuming consistency between the two, right? Never judge freshness on one track alone. Always look for multiple prints. Compare exposure differences and think about what the weather's been doing since the animal passed. I've lost count of the times I've cut tracks that look like they were laid down that morning, only to realize they were 2 or 3 days old, preserved by cold shade. But I've also cut trails that look soft and melting, then realized a small morning storm had just blown through and the elk were only minutes ahead of me. The difference is in the details: edges, depth, drift, moisture, and exposure. If you train yourself to look beyond track or no track and instead read those subtle changes, you'll go from chasing old ghosts to following animals that are still on the move in front of you. This episode is brought to you by Tidewee and their revolutionary see-through ground hunting blind. If you've ever hunted out of a traditional blind, you know the trade-off. Either you can't see out without cracking a window, or the second you do, you risk being spotted. That's where Tidewee's see-through ground blind changes the game. From the inside, you get a full 270-degree field of view through 3 walls of one-way see-through mesh. You can see every movement outside without opening a thing. But from the outside, you stay completely concealed. Game animals can't see in, even when you're sitting just a few feet from them. This blind is fast and simple to use. The pop-up hub system lets you set up or take down in just a couple minutes. Noise-free sliding windows give you multiple shot options without spooking animals. Brush-in loops let you blend it into your surroundings, and the open bottom design makes it easy to stay quiet and comfortable. You can choose between two sizes, the 2 to 3 person or the larger 3 to 4 person version like the one I'm using here. And you've also got your choice of 150D or the more durable 300D fabric, so you can pick what fits your style of hunting best. The price of this blind is already phenomenal, but you can get another 18% off by using code BBU18 at checkout. That's BBU18. If tracks are the easiest sign to spot in cold weather, droppings, your poop, are the most misunderstood. I can't tell you how many hunters I've seen walk past a pile of pellets, glance down and say, fresh. But in freezing temps, looks can be deceiving. The cold preserved dropping is almost like a freezer, and unless you know what to look for, you might end up trailing animals that left the area days ago. The first detail I check is moisture and sheen. Fresh droppings have a glossy surface, whether they're pellets from deer or larger clumps from elk. That shine dulls quickly in warm weather, but in cold conditions, it can stay much longer. Here's the key. In freezing temps, shine without softness doesn't equal fresh. A pile can look wet and glossy but feel frozen solid because it's been sitting overnight. I'll nudge it with a stick or boot. If it crumbles hard or has an icy shell, it's not as new as it looks. If it smears or gives slightly, that's truly fresh. Color is another clue here, right? Fresh droppings are dark, almost black or deep brown, depending on what the animal's been eating. As they age, they fade to lighter brown or even grayish green. But again, cold weather can slow that fading dramatically. A pile that would bleach in the sun in 24 hours can stay dark for days in the shade. That's where context matters. If you're on a south-facing slope with good sunlight and the droppings are still black and moist, they're likely fresh. If you're in a shaded, frozen draw, that same color could be 48 hours old. Temperature also affects how droppings break down. In warmer conditions, pellets start to dry and shrink quickly. In freezing temps, they often freeze solid and hold their shape. What I watch for is whether the pellets have frozen together into a cluster or if they're still separate. Fresh droppings often stick lightly together from moisture, while older frozen ones are more loose, rattling around when you kick them. Another trick I use is checking the core temperature with my hand. I'll pick up a pellet or two or just lay the back of my hand on it, and feel if there's any residual warmth. In very cold weather, warmth disappears quickly, sometimes within 15 minutes. But in more moderate freezing temperatures, you'd be surprised how long droppings hold heat. If they feel even slightly warm, you're on a trail that's almost red hot. Droppings also tell you about diet and behavior. In late season cold, elk and deer are often transitioning to woody browse and coarse grasses. That makes pellets drier, harder, and more fibrous. If you find droppings that are still loose, soft, or clumped together, that usually means they've been feeding heavily on greener forage, either because they found a pocket of fresh feed or because warmer conditions allowed it. That's intel you can use to decide whether to stick with that group. The last piece is quantity and distribution. A single pile doesn't tell you much beyond an animal was here, right? Multiple fresh-looking piles spread across a bedding or feeding area with consistency and moisture and shape tells you the animals spent real time there. If the piles all look the same age and freshness, you're probably within the same day of activity. If you see old chalky piles mixed with a few moist ones, it might just mean animals passed through without hanging around. Droppings are easy to overthink in cold weather, but they're also one of the most reliable pieces of the puzzle if you slow down and actually handle them, right? Shine, softness, color, clustering, and warmth, all of those together tell you not just when animals were there, but also what they were doing and what they were eating. And when combined with tracks, you start building a timeline that keeps you from chasing yesterday's herd. When the mountains lock up in cold weather, beds also become some of the most telling and overlooked sign you can find. A good bed tells you not only that an animal was there, but how recently they were there, how long they stayed, and in some cases, even which direction they left. In snow or frost, beds leave behind a signature that can be read like a book if you know what to look for. The first giveaway in fresh snow is melt and compression. When an elk or deer lies down, the heat from its body melts the snow beneath and compresses it into layers, right? A fresh bed will have damp or even slushy snow at the bottom, sometimes with steam rising in really cold conditions. That moisture doesn't last long. Within an hour or two, it refreezes into a slick, icy layer. If you see wet, dark snow in the depression, odds are you missed that animal by minutes. If the bed is frozen solid but still smooth and shiny, they were there earlier that morning or overnight. In frost, the tell is different. A fresh bed melts the frost crystals completely where the body made contact, leaving a sharp contrast with the surrounding vegetation. As time passes, frost reforms, first as a thin crystalline edge creeping back into the depression, and later as a full coating. If you see melted vegetation with frost beginning to build back up, you're probably looking at a bed less than a few hours old. If it's fully refrosted, it could be from the previous night or earlier. Another detail to watch is the edges of the bed. Freshly melted snow or frost often has clear, crisp boundaries, especially where the animal's legs or chest pressed into it. Over time, those edges soften as wind drifts snow back or frost crystals blur the outline. The sharper the bed, the fresher it is. Beds also tell you about animal behavior. A single isolated bed in the timber often belongs to a lone bull or a buck. Multiple beds grouped together, especially in semi-open cover, usually mean cows or does with young. If the beds are scattered loosely, the group likely fed in that area before lying down. If they're packed tight, they may have been conserving heat in colder conditions. Knowing which scenario you're looking at helps you decide whether to still hunt the area or move quickly to cut a trail. One overlooked clue is vegetation disturbance. In cold weather, flattened grass or brush will often freeze into position. Freshly bedded areas feel soft and springy under your hand. Older ones stiffen as frost locks them in place. If you press your hand into vegetation and it still pops back slightly, that bed hasn't been empty long. Pay attention to exit trails as well. Animals almost always have obvious tracks leading away from a bed in snow, but in frost, the departure can look like a faint line of melted patches, especially if they left before sunrise. If you can follow that line before the frost fully reforms, you're essentially shadowing them in near real time. The last piece I always emphasize is location context. Beds in open south-facing slopes often look fresher than they are because the sun accelerates the melting. Beds in north-facing slopes and timber can look older than they are because frost lingers long after the animal left. This is where layering knowledge from previous sections matters. Track sharpness, droppings, and surrounding disturbance all confirm whether that bed was made an hour ago or 2 days back. A bed isn't just a hole in the snow. It's a snapshot of time, temperature, and animal behavior. If you train yourself to look for moisture, frost reformation, sharp edges, vegetation stiffness, and exit trails, you'll stop seeing beds as random depressions and start seeing them as real evidence of how close you are to catching up. Urine and scent markers are some of the most overlooked pieces of sign in colder weather, yet they can be amongst the most reliable if you know how to read them. Animals leave scent constantly, right? Through glands, droppings, and urine. And in warm conditions, those smells dissipate fast. But in cold weather, everything changes. Low temperatures can both preserve and disguise scent, and if you understand how, it becomes another tool that you can gauge freshness. The first thing I look for is urine and snow. When an elk or deer relieves itself on fresh snow, the first sign is obvious, a yellow stain melting into the white. In truly fresh urine, the snow is slushy, the edges are damp, and you may even see steam if it's bitter cold. Within a short time, sometimes as little as 30 minutes, that slush begins to refreeze. The edges crust over, the yellow darkens, and the stain looks flat instead of wet. If you kick it and it breaks apart like ice chips, it's no longer a hot sign. But if it smears or still feels damp underneath, that animal could be minutes ahead of you. When there's no snow, reading urine gets a lot harder. On frozen ground, look for dark patches where moisture is pooled. Fresh urine will darken the soil or vegetation dramatically, while older patches begin to blend back into the surrounding ground as they dry and freeze. If the soil is rock hard and brittle under your boot, that sign has aged. If it's still pliable or damp, you're close. Another key is scent itself. In warmer months, the smell of urine or glandular secretions is strong, right? But it can fade quickly. In cold weather, scent molecules disperse more slowly. That means two things. A strong smell is often fresher than you think because in the cold, odors don't carry as far. And two, faint smells can linger for hours or even days, especially in sheltered timber. I've tracked bulls in late October where I caught just a faint musky odor on the wind, only to discover they had bedded there probably at least 12 hours before. Without knowing how cold slows scent dispersal, I would have assumed that I was right on top of them. One overlooked clue is frozen urine crystallization. In very low temps, urine freezes almost immediately, forming a thin shell of ice crystals across the top of the patch. That shell tells you that sign is recent enough that it froze before soaking fully into the ground. If you scrape through and find liquid beneath, you're essentially on a live trail in those really cold conditions. Scents from rubs, scrapes, and beds also change in the cold. A fresh rub worked by a bull often carries a sharp, kind of a resinous odor from sap and musk. In freezing conditions, that scent lingers longer, especially in still air. Beds can hold a really strong musky odor from elk or deer coats, but in open wind, it disperses fast. The trick is to pair scent strength with environmental conditions. If it's breezy and you still pick up odor, that's almost always fresher sign. If it's calm and you smell faint musk, you need to consider that it might be older. I always try to tell hunters to train their nose as much as their eyes, especially with elk. Don't ignore faint scents because you assume they're too old. In cold weather, a faint odor may mean the animal was there earlier the same day. Conversely, don't assume a strong smell means an animal is close. It may just be that cold, dense air has trapped scent into a pocket. Always verify with visual sign like tracks or droppings before trying to make a plan or a move. Urine and scent may seem subtle, but when combined with tracks, droppings, and beds, they can tighten your timeline significantly. They tell you not just where animals were, but how recently they marked that spot, and whether you should be slowing down, glassing hard, or picking up the pace to cut in front of them. By now we've covered tracks, droppings, beds, and even scent. But here's the truth. None of that means much if you don't understand how the environment changes the story. In cold weather, the mountain itself can fool you. Sun, wind, slope, and even quick weather swings can make old sign look brand new or turn fresh sign into something you'd walk right past. If you don't factor those variables in, you'll misread the mountain a lot of the time. The first big one is sun exposure. South-facing slopes catch the most sun, right? That means snow melts faster, frost burns off earlier, and sign weathers more quickly. A track made at dawn on a south slope might look soft and rounded by noon, even though it's only a few hours old. Meanwhile, that same track on a north-facing pocket might hold sharp edges until the following day. If you're not paying attention, you'll think the south slope track is old and the shaded track is fresh, when in reality, they were made at the same time. Wind is another major factor. Even a light breeze can drift powder back into the track, right? Filling it in and making it look older. Wind also scours frost off vegetation, leaving bare patches that mimic beds or feeding sign. I've watched hunters follow a trail in the open only to lose it completely because they assumed the filled-in tracks were old. In reality, the animals had passed just hours before and the wind erased the trail. The opposite is true in timber. Lack of wind preserves sign, keeping it looking fresh for much longer than it really is. Then there's temperature swings. In the Rockies, you can get a 20-degree change between morning and mid-afternoon. Those swings can melt droppings into a glossy mess, then refreeze them into hard pellets by evening. If you only see the frozen stage, you'd assume they're days old when they might just be from that morning. Beds behave the same way. Frozen in the morning, thawed by midday sun, then glazed over again by evening. Without knowing the recent temperature patterns, you're reading blind, right? Another trick here is to factor in snowfall and frost crystals and those frost cycles. A light dusting of snow can cover fresh sign completely, then partially melt to reveal it again later. Hunters see those re-exposed tracks and assume they're fresh because the top layer looks clean. In reality, they could be several days old, buried and then uncovered. Frost does the same thing. Animals that move before sunrise melt patches in the frost, but once the sun rises, the whole slope melts out. By the time you arrive, you can't tell the difference between beds made at 6 a.m. and ones made the night before unless you're paying attention to patterns across the slope. Slope orientation adds another layer. South slopes melt out faster and regrow forage sooner, so animals bed and feed there differently than on shaded north slopes. East slopes catch morning sun, which makes early sign melt and dry faster, while west slopes hold frost longer into the day. Knowing how each aspect interacts with weather gives you a huge edge in reading time frames. The final factor that tricks hunters is microclimate variation. A sheltered timber pocket can be 10 degrees colder than the open ridge just 200 yards away. Sign inside the timber might freeze solid and hold scent for hours, while sign on the ridge bakes out quickly. If you don't account for those microclimates, you'll misjudge which areas the animals are truly using right now. The bottom line is this: you can't judge sign without first judging the environment. Every track, dropping, bed, or rub has to be measured against slope, sun, wind, and temperature. Without that context, you'll be wrong half the time. With it, you start to see the mountain as a timeline with different zones, aging sign at different rates. That's the skill that separates hunters who consistently stay on fresh animals from those who wander trails that are already cold. But the real magic here happens when you stop looking at those signs individually and start layering them into a complete system. One clue by itself can fool you. Multiple clues stacked together tell you the truth. Here's how I build my system in the field. First, I establish a baseline with tracks. If I cut a trail, I immediately ask, how sharp are the edges? How deep is the print? Has snow drifted in or melted? That gives me my starting point. Next, I look for confirmation from the droppings, from the poop. If I find pellets along that same trail, I check moisture, color, and temperature. If they're glossy and still damp, that tightens my time frame. If they're frozen solid but still dark, I know I'm probably hours behind, not days. Beds are my third piece of the puzzle. If I find a depression in frost or snow, I check for melt, refreeze, and vegetation stiffness. A fresh, wet bed confirms I'm closing in. A frozen, slick bed means I'm behind, but still on the right path. From there, I factor in environmental context. What's the slope aspect? What's the sun doing? Has wind filled in those tracks or preserved them? Am I in timber where sign lasts longer or open ridges where it burns out faster? By weighing those factors, I adjust how much stock I put into each piece of sign. And finally, I use scent and disturbance as tiebreakers, right? If I catch even a faint odor of musk, or if vegetation still feels damp and pliable, I know I'm dealing with very recent activity. The system isn't about chasing every clue, it's about combining multiple indicators until you can say with confidence, this sign is hot enough to hunt. That's the mental clock you want to develop. It takes time and mistakes, but once it clicks, you're going to stop second guessing yourself. Instead of wandering country full of old sign, you'll zero in on the areas that are truly alive right now. And that's the difference between covering miles and actually finding animals. Judging the freshness of sign in cold weather is one of those skills that separates serious hunters from casual ones. The mountain doesn't hand you easy answers. It throws snow, frost, wind, and sun at you, and it dares you to figure out the truth. Most hunters look at a single pile of droppings or a sharp track and call it good. The hunters who consistently fill tags in the late season take the time to weigh every factor: edges, moisture, melt, scent, slope, and weather. And they layer all of those pieces into a complete picture. The biggest mistake a lot of hunters make are assuming all sign is fresh in cold weather, ignoring environmental context or relying on one clue alone. If you avoid those traps and you build your own system, you'll always know whether you're hours behind, a day behind, or shadowing animals that are still in the basin. And that confidence lets you hunt with purpose instead of guessing. If you want to take this type of knowledge even deeper, gear planning, backcountry checklists, fitness prep, and one-on-one strategy breakdowns, I'd encourage you to check out Team Backbone. Membership gives you full access to the member-only content vault, our private Facebook group, direct call, text, and email access with me, monthly giveaways, and an exclusive Backbone Unlimited t-shirt mailed to you each month that you can't get anywhere else. Team Backbone isn't just a discount club, it's the inner circle of hunters who want to train harder, hunt smarter, and live relentless. So I'd encourage you to step inside, sharpen your edge, and surround yourself with hunters who push you forward. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.